everyone, and welcome to our Psychology 82-160 class. So by now, hopefully you've already had your first class with me on September 9th, and I will have went over the syllabus and kind of explained how the class format is going to go, how the testing format is going to go, and basically what you need to do to succeed in this class. So this lecture is going to be a pretty short one. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to record an audio lecture / video. I'll be posting it as a video file on YouTube, and I will be going through the notes, and at the end of every module I'll create a new video. So this is just going to be for module 1 of chapter 1. The first chapter I am going to try just doing the audio recording. I had planned to do kind of a little picture video down in the corner, but that's a lot trickier to do, plus it takes a lot more effort in terms of the uploading times and things like that. So we're going to try this lesson as audio only, and then for chapter 2 maybe I'll try some video lessons, and then at the end of the first couple chapters you all can tell me what you feel. I'll post a poll to our page. So for now we're just going to do audio only, and basically I'll just be going through the notes and explaining things as we go, and then if you have any questions during class time, so for example this one is for Friday, September 11th class, so during that class time I'll have a Moodle chat room open and you can come and chat with me and ask any questions you might have. So you're going to want to try to watch the videos a little beforehand, perhaps. If you'd like, you can get up and watch the video that morning, and usually they're not going to take the full 50 minutes, so you'll still have time to ask questions after that. But really I'll post them early so you can watch the video at your own pace, and then you can come to class during class time in our chat room and ask any questions you might have. And then at the end of each 2 chapters, right before the test, I will have a Zoom class just like our initial class where you can come and ask any questions before our test. So we'll get started with chapter 1. So first I just wanted to let you know a little bit about me. You'll probably have heard some of this stuff in Wednesday's class, but my name is Sally Payne. I have a master's in what's called applied social psychology, as well as a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and I'm actually starting my doctorate in clinical psychology this semester. So my office hours, unfortunately, we don't really have offices due to COVID right now, or we won't really be spending much time in our office. So basically, if you want to meet with me for whatever reason to discuss grades or course content, just email me and we can schedule a Zoom appointment. My email is paynes@brandonu.ca, and our Moodle enrollment key, which I'm sure you know by now since you're on this page, is Dagobah. So if any of you are Star Wars fans, you might get that. We're big Star Wars fans in my household. So chapter 1 is all about introducing psychological science. So we're basically going to talk a bit about the history of psychology and how it came to be the field that we know today. And we'll talk about what makes psychology a science. So first I want to ask you a question. What comes to mind when you hear the word psychology? So you can take a couple seconds just to think about what you might have heard in the media, what you might have read about. What does psychology mean to you? So basically, there are a lot of different fields in psychology. There are a lot more than people tend to realize. Not only in psychology can you have clinicians, who are the people working in the mental health field, so the counselors, the clinical psychologists, the psychiatrists. You can also have researchers who work basically in a laboratory setting, conducting experiments and studies. You can have professors, like myself, who are teaching psychology to students at a university or a college. And you can have applied psychologists, who are basically the ones that are taking the results of that research and applying it to real-world settings. And of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. One person can be can fill multiple different roles. So for example, I am right now acting as your professor, but I'm also trained in research, specifically applied research, and I am training to become a clinical psychologist. So technically I kind of check all of the boxes here in one capacity or the other. So it doesn't mean that you have to be one or the other. These are just a few of the different fields or the different kind of types of careers that psychologists can find themselves in. So module 1.1, which we'll cover today, is the science of psychology. It's a very short module. It just introduces you to a few important concepts and basically the key elements of psychological science that make psychology scientific rather than pseudoscientific. So the very first thing we'll talk about is real psychology versus pseudoscience. So psychology is known and technically defined by our textbook as the scientific study of behavior, thought, and experience, and how they can be affected by physical, mental, social, and environmental factors. So basically it kind of encompasses everything that makes a person who they are. Their behaviors, their thoughts, how different experiences can affect different people in very dramatically different ways, and basically how all of these different factors interact to make us who we are. So the science of psychology relies heavily on the use of the scientific method, which is a way of learning about the world through collecting observations, formulating theories, and making predictions based on those theories. So it's not just going out and observing something and saying, oh, you know, I have a theory about that, I think I can explain it. It's actually using the scientific processes that have been validated and proven reliable in order to kind of examine the world around us. Popular psychology, on the other hand, or pop psych, is psychology as seen on television or found in many self-help books. So it's a type of something that we call a pseudoscience. So a pseudoscience is when something is presented as scientific. It might use scientific terminology and things like that to make it sound credible, but it does not actually utilize scientific thinking or procedure. So some examples of common pseudosciences are things like astrology, phrenology, which is something we'll talk about a bit later. And despite the fact that a lot of people know not to kind of look too seriously into these things, there are still a lot of people out there who really strongly believe in them. So for example, in 2005, there was a survey conducted which suggested that 25% of Canadians actually believe position of stars can affect your behavior. So there's a lot of pseudoscience out there, and as scientific researchers and scientific psychologists, we must be able to kind of examine research or examine a claim critically and basically determine whether or not it's based in scientific fact. So that's what we're going to talk about in this module. So some examples of pop psych in everyday life. I'm sure you've probably heard all of these at some point. A lot of people say that most women suffer from emotional symptoms of premenstrual syndrome or PMS. Many people think that by playing Mozart symphonies or other classical music to your infant, it's going to help them become smarter. A lot of people often think that abused children are destined to become abusive parents themselves. So there's a lot of talk about that cycle of abuse. And others ask the question, do policies of abstinence from alcohol, so where you're basically told that you cannot have any, actually reduce rates of alcoholism? And as we'll see throughout the course of our time together, a lot of these, even though they're very kind of commonly held knowledge and would be considered fact, none of these are really based in scientific evidence. So we'll talk a bit about them as we move on. But that's just some examples of really common kind of popular psychology beliefs that aren't really based in science. So now we'll talk a bit about the scientific method. So the scientific method is basically at the core of psychological research. The scientific method involves an interaction between constructing theories and then formulating and testing hypotheses. So we need to kind of define these two terms. A theory is an explanation for a broad range of observations. It's basically something that generates new hypotheses and helps integrate numerous findings into a whole. So it's more kind of a very broad network of interconnected observations and kind of different phenomena. Whereas a hypothesis is much more specific. It's a testable prediction about processes that can be observed and measured. So it must be falsifiable, which means it's precise enough to be disproven. And that is a very important point, and we'll come back to that later on. The next chapter we'll talk a bit more about research. But falsifiable basically means that you can't create a hypothesis that's impossible to disprove. So, for example, a lot of the things you'll see in pseudoscience, so for example, if an astrologist or a psychic tells you that, you would do well to avoid important phone calls or emails for the next few days, you can't prove that wrong. There's no way that you can prove that that's not accurate. Because if you do avoid your emails and calls, maybe you won't get bad news, but that doesn't really prove that it was because you avoided those calls. And it can't really be disproven because it's not specific enough to be tested. So when we're making hypotheses, it has to be a testable prediction and it must be falsifiable. It's important to note as well that theories are not the same thing as opinions or beliefs. All theories are not equally plausible, and the quality of the theory is not related to the number of people who believe it to be true. So unfortunately, a lot of people believe that if they have an opinion about something, they'll say kind of, I have a theory about that. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about scientific theories. That's just a personal opinion, and those are not treated the same as a scientific theory that's been backed up by evidence and had its observations tested through the scientific method. Also, as much as people would like to think that every opinion is created equal, we know that all theories are not equally plausible. And finally, despite the fact that there are theories that a lot of people really believe in and they think that it seems really logical and makes a lot of sense, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the theory is great just because a lot of people believe in it. So for example, studies even as recent as 2018 have reported that only 68% of Canadians, and even less Americans, believe in evolution. So the theory of evolution, as we know, has a lot of scientific backing, a great amount of evidence for it, but despite that, you still have over 30% of people who choose to not believe in that theory. So just because a bunch of people think it's wrong doesn't mean that that theory is not a quality theory. So this is just a little diagram that kind of illustrates the scientific method. You might notice that a lot of my diagrams and my slides have the copyright 2018. That's from the second edition of this textbook. So we just switched to the third edition this semester. And while I am using the third edition in terms of going through and double checking my notes to make sure things line up from previous years, I won't be changing things over if they're exactly the same. So even though this says 2018, that exact same diagram is in the most current edition, so I won't replace it just because it's from the older edition, especially because most of the content should be relatively the same. So you can see you've got your theory here, and from your theory you generate hypotheses, so those specific predictions about a set of observations. Then you're going to test your hypothesis. So basically you're either going to get evidence to help you confirm your hypothesis, or that will tell you need to reject your hypothesis. So because that hypothesis is falsifiable, there is a way of proving it wrong. Then you're either going to get kind of one or the other. You're either going to go, well, I have evidence to support my claim. It's important that we cannot ever say that we fully confirm a hypothesis, but we can find support for it. Or we need to reject our hypothesis, which means we kind of need to go back to the drawing board and either revise our original theory or modify our original hypotheses. If we get evidence, we find evidence to support our hypothesis, then we're able to generate another new hypothesis and help confirm and strengthen the original theory. So it's a cycle. It's very cyclical, as most science is, but there are a few different routes you can take depending on whether or not the evidence that you obtain supports your hypothesis that you have generated. So next we're going to talk briefly about something called the biopsychosocial model. So our thoughts and behaviors are affected by multiple influences, so we must adopt multiple perspectives in order to understand them. We don't exist in a vacuum. It's not like people are just influenced by biology, just influenced by their psychology, or just influenced by the society and the culture around them. There are elements of all three of those things that are kind of combining together and interacting to make us who we are. So the biopsychosocial model examines and explains behaviors as a product of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. So some examples of biological factors might be things like your hormone levels, your brain structures, different chemicals, neurotransmitters, and hormones within your body. For psychological, things like your memories, your emotions, your personalities, so all those things that are related to your thought processes, those would be kind of part of the psychological. And then the social will be your family, your peer groups, your ethnicity, and even the cultural groups that you are a part of. So all of those things interact together to basically make a person who they are. And so in psychology, whenever we are looking at a particular phenomenon or a particular observation that we want to explain, we're going to try to look at it from all three perspectives. So here's a nice figure from your textbook. Again, you'll see the 2018 here, but it's the exact same same figure that's in your current textbook. So we have our biological, which again is our genes, our brain anatomy and function and evolution. We'll have a full chapter coming up on that. We have our psychological, which is our behavior, perception, thought, and experience. And we have our social cultural, which is our interpersonal relationships, families, groups, societies, and ethnicities. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that can influence our experience and our behavior. And one of the last things I want to talk to you about briefly in this module is the importance of scientific literacy. So this textbook takes the concept of scientific literacy very seriously. In fact, in every single chapter in the textbook, you'll find at least one example where they basically work through this model for scientific literacy with a specific example, a specific phenomenon. So scientific literacy basically refers to the ability to understand, analyze, and apply scientific information. So the first step in our model for scientific literacy would be the knowledge gathering. So if you have a particular topic or hypothesis you're interested in exploring, the first thing to ask yourself is, what do we already know about this? What has already been studied and been found? The second is the scientific explanation. So we're going to look into different theories and different associated phenomena that might help us kind of understand how science can explain what it is we're hoping to research. Next, we use our critical thinking, which is a very important component of all scientific research, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But we basically want to know if we can critically evaluate the evidence that we're being given. And then finally, we need to know what the actual application of this knowledge will be. So that's great. You know, we've conducted our experiment or our study. We now see that A is associated with B, but how is that going to help us in the real world? Why is it relevant? How can we apply it? So we'll go through the first example from the textbook that kind of takes you through the scientific literacy model with respect to planning how to study. So there's a big section in your textbook. You'll see them for every chapter. I won't go through them every single time because honestly it's just basically taking you through that method. But in this case I will, just to kind of show you what we're talking about. So the very first thing that it talks about in our example is, what do we know about timing and studying? So we're looking at that knowledge gathering phase. What is it we already know? So we can look at mass learning versus spaced or distributed learning. So mass learning is basically sitting down and cramming all of your information into one session. So the student who waits until the night before the test to study both chapters and crams it all in one session, that would be considered mass learning. Spaced or distributed learning, on the other hand, is a student who basically takes the time to kind of carve out maybe an hour or two each night to study, so they're not cramming everything into one day. And what we have seen based on the evidence so far is that those two strategies are not equally effective in terms of recall of the information that you're trying to learn. So the second phase in our scientific literacy model will be looking at how can science explain the effect of timing and study on success. So basically we look at what we found during that knowledge gathering phase. We found that there is definitely a difference in terms of effectiveness, and we seem to find that distributed or spaced learning tends to lead to better subsequent recall than the mass learning. And so at this point we're basically looking for an explanation. Why might that be? So one of the things that scientists have come up with is that maybe information learned in a mass setting, so if you're trying to cram everything in at once, it eventually becomes kind of repetitive. And unfortunately, the more repetitive something is, the more we tend to disengage. We're not maybe paying as close attention as we would have been. So basically, by trying to cram everything in, you're kind of overloading your brain to the point that things start to become repetitive and you start to kind of disconnect from that information and not really encode it as well. So that might be just one of the reasons, based on the evidence, that the distributed or spaced learning tends to show kind of better results for recall than the mass learning. The third part here is asking, can we critically evaluate this evidence? So for that, we must examine the limitations of the research that's been done so far and look for alternative explanations. So one of the things that was kind of noted in this case is that, okay, we've seen based on laboratory studies that the spaced or distributed tends to lead to better recall, but that's not really putting it within a real life setting. So a researcher named Gluckman conducted a study using applied psychology where they actually went out into the classroom and taught students in an elementary school in 2 different ways. Well, 3 different ways, technically. So what they did is they basically came in on a Monday and gave them all 4 lessons at once, or they came in on a Monday and then a Tuesday, which we called kind of clumped learning, and they gave them 2 lessons each day, or they came in every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and gave them 1 lesson per day, which would be the more distributed learning schedule. So essentially what they found, and we'll see the figure here in a second, is that the students in the clumped or the distributed learning settings tended to recall a lot more information when they were tested a week later than the ones who had been subjected to that massed learning setting. So that's an example of how we can kind of use applied psychology and look at something in a real life setting to make sure that it kind of generalizes to the real world as opposed to just being something that we can observe in a laboratory. And then finally, the 4th question we have to ask is, what is the relevance? So why do we care? How can we apply this knowledge about what type of learning strategy is better? Well, obviously, the most kind of obvious application that we might think of is that it might help benefit with grades. So if you know as a student that that kind of spaced or distributed learning schedule is going to lead to better recall on your test, then that might kind of affect the way you study and subsequently affect the types of grades that you obtain. Another potential application is that this information may be useful clinically. So if we're working with people who have a brain injury or are trying to recover from, say, a stroke or some other medical condition, you might want to engage in short periods of kind of rehabilitation and learning with them rather than giant clumped together periods, because that's going to lead to better recall and better improvement over time. And just to show you the figure I was talking about, in that study that I just discussed, you can see that the massed and the clumped students, when we're looking at the memory improvement over time, the students who were subjected to the mass learning schedule and the clumped learning schedule performed at a much lower capacity than the students who were subjected to the distributed learning schedule. So we definitely do see that even in a real world setting, in a real world application, the difference between learning styles definitely kind of makes a difference in terms of their results. Finally, the last thing I'm going to mention in this module is called critical thinking. And I mentioned this before, it's part of that scientific literacy model, but I said we'd come back to it because it in itself is one of the essential components of scientific literacy and of science in general. So critical thinking is our ability to exercise curiosity and skepticism when evaluating the claims of others, and also within our own assumptions and beliefs. So it's very important to scientific literacy because as scientists or as consumers of science, we can't just take everything at face value. We must be willing to question and be curious and examine other explanations. So there's a core set of habits and skills for developing critical thinking, and it's important to note that no one is a perfect critical thinker. This is not something that's going to kind of appear overnight. It's something that's a lifelong process to kind of work on, but in general, if you're able to kind of follow these guidelines, it will help you think more critically about the research and the information that you consume. So the very first is be curious. And it kind of sounds obvious, but at the same time, what many people consider common sense is not always correct. So for example, for a long time, people thought that if you had a stroke, it made sense to rest your brain for the period following the stroke, because obviously that was strenuous on your brain and, maybe we should give you some time off before we start working on recovery. But if you actually look at the scientific evidence, it shows that people recover much better if they are kind of engaging in mental activity right away after a stroke. So just because something kind of seems like common sense doesn't mean it's correct. The second guideline is to examine the nature and source of evidence. This is very important because even people who sound scientific and look like they're doing research scientifically, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're using validated and reliable methods or that they aren't kind of hiding some results or unfortunately even tampering with data at times for things like financial benefit. So a major example of this, and I'll talk about this again next chapter, is the scientist Andrew Wakefield, who claimed to have discovered a link between vaccines and autism. Basically, it was determined that he had falsified a lot of his data. He was in a space where he would gain financially from finding that link between vaccines and autisms, and he basically used that to his advantage and published research in which the data was actually fabricated, which is kind of the number one rule, the big no-no of statistics. So he lost his license. He was a physician. He lost his license and was completely discredited. But unfortunately, because he put that research out there, a lot of people grabbed a hold of it. And to this day, there are still people that argue the link between vaccines and autism. So it's very important to examine the nature and the source of the evidence you're obtaining and make sure it's a reliable and valid source. The third kind of guideline for critical thinking is to examine assumptions and biases. So both your own, because obviously, even though we don't like to admit it, everyone has things that they kind of assume are true, or on controversial topics, you probably sit on one side or the other, but it is really important to make sure that you're not letting your biases and assumptions get in the way of your critical thinking. So for example, an example of the biases or assumptions of others, if you're looking, for example, at climate change research, which of course there has been a lot of in recent years, sometimes you'll notice that the articles that are kind of claiming that climate change isn't as bad as it's made out to be, if you actually look into it, a lot of that research is conducted or financed by oil companies who obviously stand to benefit from people kind of not believing that climate change is such a big thing. So we got to look at who's providing that evidence. It kind of relates back to that point number 2, and make sure that the people who are giving you this information don't have something to gain or don't have a bias towards the results of that research. The fourth, and I mean they're all kind of related to each other, but this one relates back to number 2 and 3 as well, is to avoid overly emotional thinking. There are obviously controversial topics that people get really fired up about, but we have to kind of set those personal opinions aside in research and really kind of look at what the evidence is showing us. So for example, just as a kind of a general one, there are a lot of differences shown in thinking patterns and behavior between men and women, and people on both sides of the argument can get kind of offended sometimes and get their backs up, but we have to not let those emotions get in the way. We need to look at what the evidence is actually telling us. The fifth is tolerate ambiguity. And all this means is that there's not always going to be a right answer. People love to think that there's going to be a clear-cut explanation, and if we work hard enough, we'll find it. But for example, something like depression, we have found so many different factors that are related to the onset and, the prevalence of depression. There are genetic factors, there are environmental factors, there are cognitive factors, but there is not just one factor that's guaranteed to result in depression. So we have to tolerate the ambiguity. We have to be open to the fact that there isn't just one answer that's going to kind of explain everything. And finally, number 6 is consider alternative viewpoints and interpretations of the evidence. So, and this is kind of, again, relates back to all of them in a way, but it's just basically saying that we can't just take one reasonable explanation and go with it. We need to make sure that we're examining all the different alternatives. And it really relates to number 5, tolerate ambiguity, because basically there are a lot of situations in which we have multiple theories for why something might function. So for example, sleep. A lot of people argue that the function of sleep might be kind of for recovery. A lot of people argue that it might be for our own protection because our predators are most active at the times we usually sleep. There are a lot of different interpretations. And we can't just take one and say for sure that it's correct, because all of them have kind of their pros and cons. So we need to be willing to consider alternative viewpoints and interpretations, and also accept the fact that there might not be one fixed answer. So that is it for Module 1. I'm sorry, I know even though it's 16 slides, it kind of goes on a bit, but it's really important that you grasp these concepts, because even though it's a short module, these are the general kind of guidelines and ways that you should be thinking about all the information that you're going to encounter in this course and even in your other courses. It's very important to be scientifically literate and to be able to understand how to consume scientific research and interpret it. So hopefully by the end of this course, and especially if you take the second course with me, by the end of these 2 courses, you'll have a better idea of how to examine research and examine claims critically. These are my puppies. You'll see them a lot. I like to kind of throw them in the slides just as a little cute break from the seriousness of the course. And so basically I will upload this, and this will be your lecture for September 11th. And then I'm going to get to work recording the second module now, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of post them both up for you, and you'll be able to watch them at your leisure and then ask any questions you have during class time in our Moodle chats. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you. I will talk to you later.